how it all went south.
This episode deals with sexual assault and abuse, so if you're sensitive to those subjects, just be aware that this episode is for mature audiences. In the spring of 1977, a young woman hitchhiking from Oregon to California was abducted while trying to get a ride to take her the last leg of her trip. The 20-year-old college student would remain a prisoner in a small Northern California home where her captors subjected her to the most painful and humiliating torture imaginable for the next 7 years of her life. If you can imagine that.
No.
But even when hearing that, know that not everything in this story is what it seems. This is the horrifying and tragic story of Colleen Stan, who would forever be known as the girl in the box. I'm Sean Kipe with Jason Hoke, and from 800 East Studios in Atlanta, this is How It All Went South. Have you ever hitchhiked? I already know the answer to that.
Oh, of course not. No, but I remember hitchhikers.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure. That was definitely late 70s, early 80s. I'm a kid, and I'm asking my parents,
Can we pick him up, Mom?
Yeah, why is that man putting his thumb out?
Yeah. It was, I'm sure people do hitchhike now, but I remember even like, my dad telling me, when he got out of the army or whatever, that's how he got home when he got out of the army. He hitchhiked back home, and it was such a common thing. This story that I'm going to share with you guys today is really part of the reason why that is not a thing anymore, nearly like it was, like you said, in the 70s and 80s. Hitchhiking has taken on a whole different meaning or dynamic.
Yeah.
It's not safe by all standards. On May 19th, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan set off from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to attend a friend's birthday party in Westwood, California, Northern California. It was a surprise visit, and, Colleen, from what I gathered, enjoyed hitchhiking. And again, this is late 70s, so it was normal, even for a woman to do this by herself. You had just come out of the Summer of Love was a decade before that, and people hitchhiked. That was the destination, was hitchhike to San Francisco, right? So even then, it was pretty safe for a woman to do it on her own. She hitched 2 rides before ending up in the town of Red Bluff, California, just 100 miles from her final destination. She stood on the shoulder of the road for nearly 30 minutes, thumb in the air, waiting for her next ride. The first car to come by was full of men, and she just didn't feel safe getting in, so she let that car go and opted to wait for another car to come along. 10 minutes later, a Dodge Colt pulled over. As Colleen approached that car, she peered in and saw 23-year-old Cameron and 19-year-old Janice Hooker. The two appeared to be a nice, normal, married couple, and their 8-month-old baby made Colleen feel at ease. Hitchhiking was something that she had done many times before, but it had become more risky lately as the capture of a serial killer in Santa Cruz, California had just happened a few years earlier.
I was just going to say the hitchhiker mode, it interplays or crosses exactly when all the serial killers from the 70s are happening.
Yeah, and isn't that crazy? I was talking to someone recently about this, but there was in the late 70s, like this string of serial killers, and a lot of them out west, California in particular. It's
very dark. It's a dark decade.
It is, yeah.
And I feel like, me, I'm obsessed with the 70s because I was born in 1971, but I was too young to understand or appreciate that decade.
Yeah.
And then you look back and you're like, what a wild, again, post, 1969, Summer of Love, Woodstock, all that stuff. And then you've got this dark, decade, the 70s, all this stuff happening, and then the 80s turns into MTV and pop culture and CNN launching and all this stuff. It's just this weird decade stuck in the middle, and I feel like it's still to this day undercovered in terms of what we know actually happened. And so a lot of what we hear now is these serial killers.
Yeah, and I mean, and there were serial killers in the 50s and in the 60s, and honestly, some of those that are probably less, not glamorized is not the right word, but less covered by the media. You know, the Night Stalker and the Hillside Strangler and all these people. You know about them. There have been plenty of movies, but it was happening for a while. But I think you're right. The 70s in particular, and even into the 80s, there was just this rash of serial killers. And maybe it was because the media focused on them more. I don't know. She climbed into the car, oblivious to the fact that her life was about to change forever, and in the worst way imaginable. The four traveled up the road several miles before Hooker pulled off to get gas. Colleen had begun to get an uneasy feeling about Hooker despite his outwardly normal appearance. I guess just the way he was acting as they got into the car, and it was just, you have three adults and an infant. At the gas station, she popped into the restroom and took the opportunity to change her blouse. While in the restroom, a strange feeling washed over her. She couldn't explain it, but something told her to jump out of the window, run, and never look back. She brushed it off and returned to the car. She settled into the back seat, and again, they drove off. But something caught Colleen's eye, a strange wooden box sitting on the seat next to her. And again, she thought nothing much of it. Why would you? It was just a box, maybe roughly 1 foot by 1 foot square, plywood, just, I guess, hadn't noticed it before. The Hookers told Colleen they wanted to go check out some ice caves in the mountains nearby and asked if she would like to join. Maybe a red flag. Your face says maybe a red flag, but
it actually sends chills up my spine a little bit. I don't know how to describe it other than that feeling when you watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time, and that weird family, that old house that I'm in the middle of nowhere and I can't get out feeling. Yeah. That's exactly what I thought of when you started to say these things, and this kind of instinct that she had that said, I need to get out of here.
I've talked about that before, that I think in every one of these stories we cover, there's always one moment where you make a decision, a victim makes a decision, and it's go left or go right. And one of those decisions, it just, regardless, changes your life in such a profound way. And the decision, I think, for her in that bathroom, that gut instinct that just said, whatever it is that's under my skin that's saying, get out, something's bad, something's wrong. And she chose to not listen to it for whatever reason. Maybe it's just whatever. They've got a kid. I'm being paranoid.
But,
and you can't fault her for that.
Well, and there's a couple with a baby and it feels normal, but it can get weird quick.
Yeah.
Like the people, they perceive a bad vibe. And like you said, acting a little strange, acting a little weird, you pick up on it. Especially if your antenna is already up just being a hitchhiker. There's a little bit of a casualness to hitchhiking, but you have also, again, all the framework of all this stuff happening out there, with serial killers, whatever, you're also going to be a little bit more careful.
Well, and you think too, when you first meet someone, even if they seem maybe a little, you kind of think, they're pretty average, but they kind of have some quirks. Once you've spent like 30 minutes with someone or an hour, you really start to then see, okay, maybe they didn't just make an off-color joke or whatever.
Right.
Then you start to see like the deeper layers of someone's personality. So I think that's what gives you your antenna goes up more and more as that goes on.
And I think too, in those situations, we can be a little bit too polite because we don't want to offend the person.
Yeah.
But the instinct really should be if it doesn't smell right, get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And sometimes we're just too polite about it. right? Like you
Yeah.
don't want to hurt their feelings, even though I do not know who you are. Sometimes, I've been in these situations. It could be as easy as someone knocking on the front door, and there's just a weird vibe. I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't. Boom.
Yeah.
That's just the way it goes.
The hookers told Colleen they wanted to go check out those ice caves and asked if she wanted to join. And at this point, honestly, I think the thinking for her was probably, what choice do I have? Like, you're in rural California, Northern California. She's going the last 100 miles or 80 miles of her trip. I think she probably just went, all right, we'll go check this out for a half hour and continue on the way, and I'll be done with this. Into the mountains they went. On an isolated road, Hooker pulled off and parked. Janice took the baby to a nearby creek, and once they were out of sight, Hooker climbed into the back seat with Colleen and brandished a butcher knife, holding it to her throat. That quickly. He blindfolded and muzzled her using a custom leather bag that covered her mouth, then picked up that mysterious hinged box that was sitting inconspicuously next to her on the seat. Only then did Colleen realize what that box was. It was a contraption that Hooker, who was a lumber mill worker, had designed and made, a custom head box that would effectively silence her. Hooker then placed the 20-pound box on Colleen's head. And to give you maybe a little bit of an idea, have you ever watched any of the Saw movies?
Unfortunately.
Okay, so, and this is the best way I could think of to describe it. We'll put a picture up of this actual box, but it is this maybe 1 foot by 1 foot square box, and there's a neck hole cut in the bottom. The front closes, and it would be worn on the head, locked from the outside, of course, and you would be completely cut off from, you can't see anything but darkness, muffled hearing. So it would be very, that's torture in itself. But if you can imagine this poor girl, the baby gets out with mom and they go to a creek and we're going to check this out. And this guy just comes back into the back seat, pulls out a butcher knife, puts it to your throat. You're stuck. To me, there's not much you can do. It's fight or flight, right?
Right.
And I don't know that fighting at that point when you're in the back of a car.
What a shocking thing to have happen.
Yeah, very quickly.
How do you react to something like that?
I don't know that there's much you can do. I mean, which of course is sort of, I think, why she's now in this situation, having this box, because if you allow that to happen, you're at their mercy.
That's sheer terror.
Oh, I can't imagine because once that thing's locked on your head, you can't even run. What are you going to run through the forest? I mean, you can't see, you can barely hear. It's 20 pounds on your head, so it's.
I don't know how this story ends up and what her fate was, but have you ever had those? They do it, kind of company training. It's one of those. It's a little bit of self-defense. It's a little bit of first aid or medical care in case of emergency. You break your arm or whatever.
Yeah.
I remember I'd never thought about this. They were talking to us as a group back in a company I worked for, and they said, if you're ever kidnapped or someone comes up to you, you need to do everything possible to try and get away immediately. Because if
you don't want to go to the second location.
You don't want to go to the second location.
No.
You do not actually want to be kidnapped and taken. It makes sense,
Sure.
but you don't think about that. I never thought about that before.
Yeah.
They say, you might get slashed with a knife or someone cut you, but you need to fight back as much as possible in as fierce a way as you can. Throw your arms, whatever that is, scream, holler, whatever, but fight, because you do not want to be on the other side of this, because it does not end well for a lot of people.
Right. Yeah. You don't want to, that's kind of rule number one. And I have heard that. I've never taken those classes or anything, but you don't want to be at location number 2,
right,
wherever they're going to take you to.
Right.
True here as well.
Okay.
Hooker concealed his passenger from passersby by unrolling her sleeping bag and draping it over her. His wife, Janice, returned to the car with their infant, and they drove around until dark before returning home. Once at the Hooker residence, Cameron led Colleen into the house through a back door and into the basement, which I assume, is to have less of a chance of neighbors seeing this woman being taken into the house with a box on her.
Can you imagine?
I was just going to say, I can't even imagine, like, if you were a neighbor and saw that, it would be so bizarre to see that. I mean, I think you'd have to call somebody, right? But he then proceeded to strip her naked, handcuff her, and hang her from the basement ceiling rafters. The torture of Colleen Stan had already begun, but not long after arriving in the home, Hooker then kicked out the wooden box Colleen was standing on, leaving her suspended by her wrists. And so, I was thinking, you think of her being suspended by these ceiling rafters by whatever, a rope or twine or chain or whatever it is, just by her wrists. And if you've ever carried anything like, I don't want to say if you've ever had handcuffs on, maybe you haven't, but something tight around your wrist that cuts off the circulation, like when you have a bunch of groceries in the little plastic bag and it just...
Oh, I heard a scream from my son when he was probably like 6 or 7 years old, and he had taken the string from the blinds and wrapped it around his thumb.
That really happens.
And his thumb turned absolutely purple. I'm like, what are you doing? He was just playing. Didn't realize what he was doing. Yeah.
It doesn't take long for that circulation to get cut off and the pain. I mean, you're talking 30 seconds, a minute. Yeah. Your hand starts turning purple. And, Hooker would not let Colleen hang, though, for more than 20 to 30 minutes at a time, as prolonged hanging could, of course, cause the loss of a limb or eventually death. So, that mentality, to me, right there says he wants to keep her alive. He wants to torture and inflict pain. It's such a bizarre and horrible beginning to a story. I mean, it's somebody who has gone to the lengths of planning this out clearly by having made this box. The great pain that Colleen was in while hanging, of course, caused her to scream in agony, to which Hooker responded each time by striking her with a whip, saying, "Shut up and just hang there." Through the edge of the blindfold, Colleen could see several bondage magazines splayed out, which depicted women hanging much like she was. Hooker and Janice then proceeded to have sex near her feet while she was hanging there. And when they finished, Hooker took Colleen down and placed her in a box he had constructed in the basement. He chained her wrists, tied her feet to hooks inside of the box, and placed the head box on her. This was day one of captivity. So in this box he's now constructed that's almost like a coffin, he has chained her wrists together and tied her ankles to hooks inside of the box, so there's no way to escape the box. Even if she did, she's chained at the wrists, and she has this head box on her it's
like being buried alive. We talked about this in another episode. Yeah. Being buried alive, that sensation that you just got nowhere to go, and your life is coming to an end. My God.
Yeah, it's horrible, horrible. And imagine, I don't know. I never saw anything in any of the research I did that said she was claustrophobic. So I don't think she was. I don't. Can you imagine being claustrophobic?
Yeah, I don't think you even have to be in this.
Sure, case. It would make you claustrophobic. But I mean, if someone had that condition, genuinely was a claustrophobic person, I just can't imagine even what that would be like. When we come back, we'll discuss Colleen Stan's next 7 years of life as a prisoner of Cameron and Janice Hooker. We'll be back. On day 2 of Colleen Stan's captivity, Hooker released her from the box. He chained her on a homemade rack, like the medieval torture rack, like stretch. I don't know what it's called. I guess it is called the rack. And he left her there, not returning until the following day. When he returned, he gave her a meal, which she was unable to finish, and that caused Hooker to become enraged, so he hung her again from the rafters and whipped her. When she finished the meal, he put her back on the rack. After several days of no contact from Colleen, her family, friends, and her roommate had become concerned. After day 4, they filed a missing persons report with Eugene, Oregon police. No leads came to light, and after 1 month, her parents had begun retracing her steps from Eugene to Westwood, California, filing missing persons reports at police stations along the way. I always say that to imagine and try to put yourself in the place of a parent who, after a day or a couple days or a week, or that's bad, but after a month or more, and it's completely out of the norm for your kid to not, especially if you're close. I can't imagine that panic and the dread and just the emotions that to me, I would imagine your life, and we know this from Justin Gaines's mother. I mean, his family, when I did Drowning Creek, they stopped. I mean, they stopped working, and it was like 4 months that they were conducting the search. They did nothing, and that became their full-time job.
Yeah.
And you think about how disruptive to your life, your life at that point changes and becomes, in a lot of ways, centered around only trying to find your kid, which I think is how I would be.
And I'm assuming that they probably knew that she had hitchhiked before,
Right.
and that was a thing. And so I think the dread would be even more, knowing that it could have been anyone on any stretch of a highway that, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
and it's hundreds of miles. So you've got this, it's not like they disappeared at the local spot in
Right.
your town.
You can go left, right, north, south, east, west on the road. It could be anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, the variables are the factors in play there.
And the amount of distance that you can cover in a month, if they were taken, in a month, it's the next 5 months passed with continued abuse and torment at the hands of Hooker. Colleen was kept naked, chained to the rack, and after the first 2 weeks was confined to this coffin-like box. She was let out once a day to eat and use a bedpan, all while done in Hooker's presence. So even when she's using the restroom, which he lets her use a bedpan at least, he's standing right there, which, I mean, it's just, and I said before, like, it's all this, not just physical torture, but the emotional and psychological torture, where it's humiliating.
I was just going to say, it's
humiliating.
As a human,
yeah, and as a woman,
yeah,
to have a man standing there, the torture from Hooker was despicable, to say the least. On a daily basis, Colleen was chained to the rack or hung from the rafters in the basement. He practiced bondage on her, restricting her breathing until she nearly passed out. He left her in the head box while he shocked her with an electrical cords, burned her pubic area with a heat lamp, and immersed her in a bathtub full of water, holding her underwater until the very last minute. And I'll say this: we'll cover things in this episode that are, as I said, despicable and horrible. But there are things that I'm not even gonna discuss that I read and researched that he did to her that I just thought was, if you think this is bad,
you think of the worst traitors or spies that have they've been put under the spotlight and they've been tortured, not that that's justified, but they're trying to get a secret out of them or something like that. She did nothing.
Yeah.
She didn't deserve this. She did nothing to deserve this. She didn't even have her own voice, right, to be able to speak her own will. She didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, it's, I don't know, unimaginable to understand why someone does these things to another human being. In the summer of 1977, Janice left home. That's Hooker's wife. Janice left home to stay with her sister as she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with what was transpiring in the couple's basement. Janice did eventually move back into the house, and Colleen was never even aware that she had left. By October of 1977, Hooker had built a triangular wooden box he called the workshop under the basement stairs for Colleen to stay in. He carpeted the walls of the box for soundproofing, and this time allowed Colleen to be unshackled once locked inside the box. Thanks. There was one small light bulb above her, and this was the first time in 6 months that Colleen was able to see.
Oh my God.
And imagine that 6 months is, I mean, it's to be in complete darkness, whether locked in a box, this coffin-like box, or to have this box on your head for 6 months, and even the physical ramifications of that.
Well, you know how sometimes you can be in complete darkness, and it could actually end up only being 1 minute that you're in complete darkness, but it feels like forever.
Yeah.
So you have no sense of time, of space, of day, of anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like you could go through this thing, it could be 30 minutes. But to think about that over weeks, days, weeks, months, my God. And by the way, like, just to comment on the wife, like, she's growing uncomfortable. Excuse me. Sorry about that.
Well, we'll get into her. In early 1978, Janice had become concerned that her husband wanted to do more with Colleen than just practice bondage. So she recommended bringing her into their bedroom, which they did, now keeping her in a box constructed underneath of their waterbed. It was at this time that Hooker began raping Colleen as a part of his torture regimen. The wife, obviously, Janice, is aware. I mean, of course, she knew that Colleen was kidnapped. It's not like he kept her in a spot on the back of the property, the family's property. She's aware of this. And I guess the idea was that he wanted to practice bondage, and that's how he sold her on this. That's the only thing I can make sense of it.
I wonder how, maybe she didn't know how she felt. Like, was she so trapped also that she, she had no escape herself, and she had no voice. I mean, to be fair to her too. I don't know. I don't know, but it's like sometimes when you don't know anything but the evil, how do you react to that?
Yeah. Or women, certainly we know, have been in these situations where they're also threatened with violence, and they're afraid for their own safety. So, battered wives syndrome, and within 1 year of Colleen's capture, the Hookers had moved 2 times, now living in a small mobile home. She was referred to in the home as K, as in like the letter K. And referred to the Hookers as master or sir and ma'am. Even when not in the box, Kay was allowed out once a day to eat, use the restroom, brush her teeth, and help with chores. She would have a collar around her neck so that she knew she was still a slave. So even, I don't think it's not a collar that had, spikes in it, or electricity hooked up to it or anything like that. It was just a leather collar around her neck that was an identifier to her at this point that you are still a slave of ours.
It's just
psychological torment, right? When 2 collars wore out, Hooker pierced her right labia with an earring for the same effect. So just that psychological, which is odd to me. I mean, I understand how it happens, that it can be the most simple thing that is an identifier for her mentally. I'm a slave, to this person. Most of her time was spent in the box under the waterbed, where she listened as Janice gave birth to their second child above her. Soon after, Janice went back to work in the evenings, and when Hooker returned from his job at the lumber mill, he would let Colleen out to fix his dinner for him. By the summer of 1980, Janice had gotten a day job, and Colleen was left to babysit while the Hookers were at work. And for a short time, she was allowed to sleep at night in the bathroom, chained to the toilet. At this point, she's not even during the day. She's babysitting the kids while they're out. So if you're wondering why Colleen hasn't run away yet with this newfound form of freedom she has each day, I'll tell you why when we come back from the break. Shortly after Colleen Stan was abducted, Hooker began to tell her that she was his slave, that she was purchased from something called the company. He told her that if she tried to run away or contact the police, her friends or family, that the company would not only kill her, but also kill her family. Hooker said that Janice, his wife, was a former slave and that he had purchased her from that company. She said later that Hooker was very convincing and would speak of the company to her and Janice frequently. So, does that make a little bit more sense now, Jason, of why, even though she was allowed out after some amount of time babysitting the kids, you would think this is your opportunity to run?
Hear about this all the time.
Yeah.
Where the power of that usually male person, the dominance, it's you cannot leave.
And the fear of not wanting your family harmed, or yeah.
It's built up all the walls where even though the door is open, you feel like you can't walk out it.
Yeah, a prison with no walls is a hard concept, but they exist. Hooker used a slave contract template that he found in one of those bondage magazines that he has subscribed to create an agreement between him and Colleen that effectively would say that he owned her, that she agreed to the arrangement of being a slave, and would take away all of her individual rights. She signed the agreement out of fear for what the company would do to her and her family if she refused. As her spirits were beaten down over long periods of physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse, Colleen developed a kind of Stockholm syndrome. Hooker even let her call her parents numerous times on the phone while he stood there to make sure she didn't, give him up. And on at least one occasion was allowed to visit them with Hooker posing as her boyfriend. He actually went with her to visit her parents, still being his captive.
Wow, that's the ultimate power of Stockholm.
Yeah,
syndrome
it's
right there.
that.
You can't mouth help me. You can't even get it out of your mouth.
No, yeah, you can't like wink or make some sort of subtle gesture. She had formed a bond of sorts and friendship by this point with his wife Janice, and the two even began going to church together. Colleen was allowed to get a job at one point, and the money she made was signed over to Hooker. So you would think she's almost on some level accepted this life at this point, right? I mean, this is now several years into this. She's visiting her parents, or has visited at least one time her parents with him. She's befriended Janice. She's going to church with her. She has a job. Any one of these situations, she has the opportunity to discreetly tell someone or go to the police, and she chooses not to.
I don't think she even had the choice anymore.
Well,
stripped from her who she was. She
Yeah.
wasn't. Can you imagine having to live under someone's waterbed and the woman's giving birth and just? I don't want to revisit anything you've already talked about because it's just so nasty. But just stripping you down to nothing.
Yeah.
There's nothing to fight back with.
Well, and the entire time, again, she has a job, visits her parents, goes to church. So the entire time, she was led to believe that the company monitored her phone calls, watched the house, and also her parents' home. Colleen would even take trips to the river with the Hookers and go on picnics, outings. Hooker forced Janice to read the Bible, specifically passages that required wives to be submissive or what he deemed to be slaves, and began raping Colleen more frequently and began to incorporate both women into his sexual escapades. Janice eventually had enough of this. She and Colleen began to speak with the pastor at their church about the sinful ways of their relationship, both sleeping with the same man. At one point, the pastor even spoke with Hooker, telling him to straighten up his act. I think that's a quote from the pastor. He told him to straighten up his act, but no mention of the box or anything else. Janice and Colleen did not tell him all of those things. They just said we feel like we're living in sin because we're both essentially sleeping with the same man. So you have this almost intervention, but not really. In 1984, Janice finally had a nervous breakdown, confessed to Colleen that the company wasn't real and that she was never a slave, and she released Colleen in 1984. Now, you would think, knowing this, Colleen does what at this point?
Um,
Knowing that there is no company watching her parents' home, her parents aren't in danger, she's now freed by Janice. What do you think Colleen does?
well, what do I think versus what actually happened versus what I hope happened is maybe another way to put it. I hope she left and was rescued and she went back to her family and spent the time to restore herself. What I actually think happened is probably she didn't go anywhere.
Maybe you're partly right. She didn't go to the police. She instead kept in contact over the phone with Janice and Cameron Hooker for some time. Out of fear of retribution, Janice and Hooker destroyed much of the bondage gear, but Janice kept some hidden as a safeguard for herself, to have evidence against her husband in case something,
Yeah.
She confided in a friend that told her Hooker might hurt her or their two children. So she once again went to the pastor and this time told him everything. And then they went to the police.
Mm-hmm.
On November 18th, 1984, Cameron Hooker was arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, sodomy, false imprisonment, and multiple sex offenses. These are actually some of the charges. 1 count of kidnapping with use of a deadly weapon, 3 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of forcible rape, 2 counts of abduction for illicit relations, and single counts of forcible sodomy, forcible oral copulation, and penetration with a foreign object. Hooker pled not guilty to all charges, stating that Colleen had agreed to this and it was all consensual. Again, remember that he had Colleen sign that agreement. So that's what he's saying, that no, she was, which shows a lot of foresight and planning on his part. Now, granted,
In a bad way.
oh, in a horrible way. I mean, of course, but that he was devising ways to, if I ever get caught, how can I get out of this? If she ever escapes or someone ever finds out, so that, this agreement, this contract was in his mind a way to get around that.
There's a podcast, I think it's called Just Believe Her. And that's all you have to say here. Believe her.
Yeah. During her confession, Janice also stated that her husband had abducted, murdered, and buried 18-year-old Marie Elizabeth Spanhawk, who was missing since January 31st, 1976. Spanhawk was buried in a shallow grave in Lassen Volcanic Park near the town of Chester, California, according to Janice. Hooker's trial was moved to another county due to the press coverage that it received. As you can imagine, imagine, and I mean, if it's one thing to look now back at archival newspapers and footage. You remember a couple years ago, and I want to say it was in 2018 or 16 or something, there were 3 girls in Ohio, I believe, that were held captive for years, and one finally escaped. Do you remember that when it hit the news?
Were they part of there was a big family that was?
No, it was a
No.
guy that held these.
The fact that we can't sort through some of these things because there's too many of them is also a problem.
Yeah, but my point in bringing that up was it was everywhere, nationwide in the news.
Right,
I mean,
right.
it was such, the girl broke out, and the guy had kept them there, I think, for 16, 18, 20 years, something like that. They had 16 years, something like that, but I mean, had fathered children by at least one of the girls. And
This story we're talking about, I'd never
Yeah.
heard of before. It's interesting, and we talked to so much about these serial killers of the 70s and everything that happened, and yet still you got something like this that I'd never heard of it before. Like, how is that even possible? Something so heinous, so awful to another human being or many human beings. Just I know we don't want. It's the last thing you want to talk about when you wake up in the morning.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's crazy.
But it's so unbelievable, things like this that happen. And I think that's why the media does go wild with this stuff, because it's so out of the ordinary. It's so unbelievable to find out that a woman was held captive by a husband and wife for 7 years on its own. That's and escapes and gets, but to also find out that she was let, free, so to speak, babysitting their kids, going, having a job, and under it's such a sensational story, and I say that in a bad way, but I mean,
Well, and with when we mentioned both Saw and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They're terrible things that happen in these movies, but after 2.5 hours, we can walk out of a theater and be like, well, it was just a
it's
movie.
just a movie.
And the fact that this you look at and is actually, equal or worse to this, but it's a real life thing, is you can't get your head around that.
Yeah. Evidence presented at trial included over 100 pieces of physical evidence, including the head box that Colleen was forced to wear, bondage photos of Colleen, a copy of the slavery contract between them, the waterbed pedestal and its concealed box, and the stretcher rack that he kept her on. Hooker was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to an intermediate term, 1 to 25 years for the kidnapping, with a consecutive term of 5 to 10 years for the weapon use enhancement, to be followed by a 69-year determinate term in state prison for the remaining offenses. Colleen Stan is alive and well today, and over the past few years, she's taken part in various film and TV adaptations of her story. I watched some interviews with her, and I'm always surprised by victims like this that are able to talk openly about this, even though it's been many years, of course, and I'm sure there's been plenty of therapy and things like that she's gone through. But now it seems like she has been able to live a normal life, to some degree. And I can't, the strength and the will to survive in this story. I mean, that's
Powerful
inspirational. Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
To be able to go through something like that would be the end of most people.
Well, and you talk about, I mean, your story, what you've told us about and me about her life as she went through this is very detailed. The only way we actually know about that is, of course, because she had to tell that
Right.
story.
Yeah.
We would have never known had she, one, had she died during all of this, but two, the fact that she escaped and had to recount all these details. Like as you've been describing this over the last however many minutes of this episode, I kept thinking, well, she actually had to tell someone else this story at some point later on, whether it was police or whether it was at trial or whether it was with the media later on, like you're saying. Like,
Her story had to get out somehow.
yeah, and the detail there.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, because you would think that with those kinds of things happening to you and for such a long time, you would push it out of your brain and not remember a lot of that. But I think the fact that she was in darkness, the only thing that she had to keep her going was her mind.
Yeah.
Because obviously she was in the dark, so her sight was taken. She was chained. She couldn't move. This box on her head. You're so limited as to what you can do to keep your mind active. And I think that might be part of the reason why she was able to remember so much in vivid detail. Because when you look through the case file, the court transcripts, she over time went into a lot of detail. And there, like I say, there have been a couple movies made about her story, and she's been a part of all of those projects, providing this is how I actually was. I think there is a movie called Girl in the Box.
Wow.
The Girl in the Box or Girl in the Box. Maybe we'll post a link, but
Well, this is why I've talked about this before, why I got kind of close on the worst of the worst stories, serial killers, all the black kids here in Atlanta being murdered for the Atlanta child murderers, or Broken Hearts, or the Zodiac killer. Like, you look at this stuff long enough, and you have to look away. And so I did. I took a big break, and that was one of my metrics. That says I'll talk about a lot, but I can't talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I think stories like that, stories like Colleen Stan's, you're reminded how bad human beings can be to one another. And it is hard, and it does make you want to look away and just avoid that stuff. But I think at the same time, you have an opportunity to look at the other side of it and see not only how strong some people are and the survival instincts some people have, but also the police officers, the investigators, that those kinds of people, that this is hard, but it's their job and they're not able to turn away from it. So I have such a tremendous amount of respect for people who do that for a living, willingly.
It also feels like, in one respect, we always say, well, this was a thing of the past and it'll never happen again. But you bring this up, like the story of the three from a couple years ago. There's always this weird story that comes out of nowhere that takes over the media, that we thought we had all this solved, and then all of a sudden it gets dropped in our laps and we can't look away.
Yeah.
Every time we think that, well, that's just the way it was hitchhiking, it was all this stuff. No, it keeps coming up for one reason or another. There's always a story like this.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like every so many years. And I think in the last 10 years, there have been a couple of these with, unfortunately, usually young women.
Yeah.
But there was another one where a guy was keeping her in like a shed in the backyard that he had constructed, and she broke out, broke free from that. So I'll never understand how people again can do things like that to other human beings, but it's out there. That's the story of Colleen Stan, the girl in the box. I'm Sean. He's Jason. This is How It All Went South.